Coolidge was the President of the United States from 1923 until 1929. He had a larger career that started when he was a city councilman in Northampton, and he worked his way up from city councilman, ran for 19 races, won 18 of them, and eventually ended up becoming President of the United States. And my book, Why Coolidge Matters, is about his political philosophy, which I argue has been edited out of the history books by New Deal historians who didn't want Coolidge to be remembered favorably. So Coolidge, in my view, was not small government. He was limited government. He believed in small r republicanism. He believed that the Declaration of Independence should be the basis of our politics, particularly its emphasis on all are created equal. He reasoned from Christian teaching that as we all have a common bond, or a common father in God the Father, so too are we equal Republican brothers. And so therefore the only form of government that's possible is republicanism. And so that this is the Declaration of Independence is sort of how he applied all of his ideas to politics in his day, and which I argue should be applied to politics in our day. Well, there's sort of this image of Coolidge as sort of this Puritan in Babylon is the title of one of the books that tried to dismiss him. I think what Coolidge understood about technology is that technology really just means, if you break it down, it means skills, right? It means, it's the Greek word that it comes from. So the skills are really about to do what, right? And I think what Coolidge understood is that technology, particularly radio, which he made excellent use of during his political career. He was, of course, a very shy man, and so he used radio to kind of communicate his messages. He understood, he was the first president to appear on television, or on film, rather. He understood that the wars of the future would be fought with airplanes. So he was very forward-thinking in his views of technology, but he thought technology was about doing things, not about changing how man actually behaves. So a lot of people, I would say today, treat the digital revolution, the iPod revolution, like it's a digital playground. And Coolidge thought that effectively, you get a car, you get a plane, or you get a radio, and it's about actually just doing more work and being more efficient. So if you look at like the 1920s, the expansion in wealth per capita in the country was it's like the equivalent of getting a 33% raise during the 6 years of the Coolidge presidency, which is pretty unprecedented. But Coolidge, if everyone sort of famously thinks of him saying is the business of America is business, when in fact in the same speech he says that the real focus of America is idealism, that if we get our idealism right, if we get our ideas right, if we get our first principles right, the technology and the economic growth will follow. And I think that's something that conservative politicians should learn today, that we need to get our principles right first before we create policies. Conservatism lately has become something of a club, that it doesn't have quite the small e evangelical, going out and trying to speak to different groups about your ideas and how they actually work. I'm not saying that one should pander to different groups. I think that's more the province of the far left and the Democratic Party. I think you should go and speak to them as fellow citizens. And Coolidge mastered this technique. He was a sort of progressive Republican who got conservative Irish Democrats to vote for him. And he did that in Massachusetts by going door to door and by talking to his fellow citizens as fellow citizens. He went and spoke in front of black groups, Irish groups, Italian groups, Jewish groups, Native American groups. He actually joined several Indian tribes after he signed the law that made Indians, all Native Americans in the country, full and equal citizens. And he did this because he thought that if they can join the tribe of America, I should be able to join their tribe, that we can have a multiracial, multi-ethnic, but not multicultural America. And I think that's something that Coolidge really typified. I mean, he He had to run for re-election in his early career every year. So he was very close to the people. He understood what they wanted, what their hopes were, what their dreams were. And it's something that conservative politicians today, I think we often get kind of snookered by the consultant class, which looks for wealthy people who've never had any real experience in politics and tries to basically take them for a ride, often convincing very wealthy conservatives in states they have no business even contending in that they can actually win elections. And that, of course, distorts our politics. Coolidge was very much a bottom-up rather than a top-down politician. It's something I think we as conservatives, we on the right, need to study as well. And they're virtually identical in some respects. I mean, obviously they didn't have gay marriage. They didn't think of those issues in quite the same way we think of them today. But public sector unions, government unions, were a hot issue at the time. There were a number of anarchist bombings in the late 19-teens, early 1920s, and Coolidge responded to all of these issues very effectively. Immigration, of course, was an issue then. There's sort of a number of issues that we can look to Coolidge to study. So, for instance, you look to government unions. Coolidge's view is that essentially a government union is a conflict of interest, in which you cannot be a public servant but also become have a loyalty to something other than the public. And so, in the famous police strike of 1919, which catapulted Coolidge to national fame, what Coolidge did was he called in the National Guard when the police officers walked off the job because they couldn't be permitted to join a union. It's something that kind of conservatives would do well to kind of study and learn from. Ronald Reagan, we know, he thought of Coolidge as his favorite president. We know that he was influenced by Coolidge's decision in the strike of 1919 when he fired all the air traffic controllers in 1981. So it's something that I think what Coolidge understood about politics is that one can actually reclaim equality as a conservative principle, and the idea that some men shouldn't rule others just by virtue of their birth or by the virtue of their degree or how long their families have been in this country. And so he was very clever about applying the idea that all men are created equal to politics, like government unions, like even the Industrial Revolution. I mean, if you think about it, an industrial revolution can be a political problem, and that if I employ you and I pay you terrible, terrible, terrible wages and basically exploit you, it's very difficult for us to have a republican form of government because I'm effectively your master and you're effectively my slave. Now, the way he solved this is not sort of through the Marxist redistribution effort. The way he solved this was he thought that stock and savings and checking accounts should be widely dispersed among the people. He encouraged people to save and to invest in the economy, to invest in themselves. So throughout his presidency, he's rattling off how everyday people are doing well with the stock market, or how everyday people are finally being able to purchase things that were once luxuries that soon became sort of necessities or enhanced the quality of life. And so he very much enjoyed the successes of his fellow man, and he did not see the materialism as something necessarily dangerous. He just saw it dangerous if the people worshipped things rather than the ideas that actually made them possible. What Coolidge understood, I think, is that immigration and foreign policy are actually part of the same policy, which is how shall we deal with the other, right? Or how shall we deal with that which is foreign? He was not against immigrants, and he did not think of it in a racial context. He says a number of flattering things, for instance, towards blacks, towards Native Americans, towards Japanese, towards Italians and Irishmen and so forth. But he did worry about the Bolshevist, what he called the Bolshevist threat. And effectively, we forget this now, but during the late 19-teens, after World War I and sort of during World War I, there was sort of an unholy alliance that formed between unions and sort of more, kind of the more far left crazy radicals, anarchists. And Coolidge, of course, dealt with this during his governorship and partly during his presidency, although most of it kind of stopped during the early 1920s. And what effectively these anarchists wanted to do is they were against the government. They wanted to overthrow the government, and they wanted to replace it with sort of a Bolshevist or communist or an anarchist state. And what was interesting about it is that, as we consider kind of the aftermath of the Boston bombing earlier this week, Coolidge dealt with similar problems. In fact, the very street in which the bombs went off earlier this week, the very street in which that happened was the same street that Coolidge actually sent the National Guard down during the police strike of 1919. And he responded to the threat of sort of domestic but foreign-inspired terrorism in his day. He of course was governor at the time of the Sacco and Vanzetti trials, which of course were a cause célèbre, even though all evidence now kind of points to them having murdered, having carried out those murders. So I think what Coolidge could tell us today in his earlier career, when it comes to foreign policy, is that there is this sense in which one has to be in favor of law and order. And if one becomes an executive, one has to execute to protect the people. Later on in his presidency, his foreign policy was sort of more hopeful in the sense that they thought that they could get naval reductions done. So they thought that they could actually, after World War I, that America could reduce the size of its navy or the size of its army, and that it could induce other nations, other civilized nations like Japan and Britain, to follow suit. Of course, as sort of he did not really believe it was possible to outlaw war, which of course is a knock against him. Many people want to blame Coolidge for America being underprepared for World War II. In fact, Coolidge, one of his final acts in March 1929, is to actually sign the law that made the first aircraft carrier as well as some carrier groups, cruiser groups. So he of course, during his presidency, very much supported the use of the airplane. He was friends with Charles Lindbergh. He thought that the airplane would be the weapon of the future, and he was very much ahead of his time. So he did not think we should get engaged in kind of pointless wars. He thought Americans and American property should be defended at all costs, anywhere. And he, particularly in Mexico, particularly in South and Central America, and he, when necessary, he used the power of the military to actually see to it. And in many respects, he was as Reagan was in foreign policy, pro national defense, not pro intervening. Or he was, as I would say, as John Quincy Adams famously said, friend of liberty everywhere, but custodian only of our own. To a certain extent, we expect our president to be a national hole in the ground filler, our therapist in chief, our friend in chief, our dictator in chief, and we expect a lot from presidents today. During Coolidge's time, it's important to note that we did not expect as many things of the government. We were sort of a different people. Of course, Coolidge, the sort of knock on him, or what everyone kind of remembers, is that he was silent cow. In fact, I argue he was silenced cow by the New Deal historians. He in fact said quite a bit. He gave 500 press conferences during his presidency. He wrote 3 collections of speeches. He wrote many more that were not collected. He wrote a very successful post-presidential column that was syndicated all over the country, actually, in fact, all over the world. And he wrote a very thoughtful, very serious autobiography. So he in fact had quite a bit to say, but he was always very careful in how he actually delivered it. He believed that the words of the president, as he said, have a tremendous weight and ought not be misused or not be squandered. So, for instance, there are many sort of stories, some of which are true, some of which are not, about how people would come in and try and ask things for him in the White House, and he would be very still, hoping that they would leave. He was very He was not inclined to kind of the backslapping, the kind of bloviating, the kind of giving his opinion on everything. He was always very thoughtful, and he was always very controlled. He thought that if he had to give he had to say something seriously, he should say it in a speech, and the speech should be written in his own hand, which he was the last president to write his own speeches, and it should be a high-minded speech. He was very proud of his speeches, and he collected them and put them into his home library to show them off. And he thought that if you speak high-minded to people, they will respond in turn. So he was against what he called the politics of expediency. He was against the idea that you should dumb down your content, your speeches. In fact, many of his speeches have a lot of classical allusions that you wouldn't know unless you were classically educated yourself. And yet they also operate on kind of a low level of like rousing up getting the kind of the average man to be interested. So he was a very clever man. He was a very well-read man. He was a very educated man, and that comes through in his speeches. Now, as to the point about his sort of moniker of Silent Cal, I think he was a painfully shy man, and he says as much throughout his autobiography and throughout his life. He had a very hard time kind of connecting with people, and so he often had ambassadors to kind of help him with other people. One of which, of course, was his vivacious wife, who was as extroverted as he was introverted, and he relied on a number of people in his presidency to kind of help him deal with people socially. And he never really got over his shyness. But he was very lucky that radio came on, so he could actually talk to the people through radio. He's the first president to make wide use of that, as well as I said earlier, the first president to appear on film. So he's not sort of a Bill Clinton, I feel your pain type. He's very much a cerebral, serious thinker. He was a Protestant Christian. He was out of Plymouth Notch, Vermont, which is sort of like, if you've ever read Democracy in America, it's sort of Tocqueville's view of Americans. Very small R Republicans, small villages, very much civic life where no one's really rich, but no one's really poor either. And this is sort of the environment which he comes out of. And during his life, during his childhood, both his mother and his sister died. So it's a family life that is just him and his father, and of course his father remarried. But that experience of sort of being without women in his life for the first part of it, I think shaped him considerably. He of course was a very Christian man. He believed that God was acting all the time through our lives, a providential God that intervenes, that cares very much about everyday citizens as much as it cares about the President of the United States and world defense. And so he really believed that God was putting him on a journey. He did not know that he was necessarily the best prepared for that journey. He didn't think of himself as a great man. In fact, he said, great man, we should be leery of great men as president because, in a republic, all are created equal. The president is really just first among equals. And so Coolidge, of course, loses his father and his son while he's president of the United States, which is a very kind of humbling thing, to be the most powerful man in the world and watch your boy sort of die from a blood blister that went septic. And he believed that God was involved in his life. He believed that that there was a price paid for him having as much power as he did as president, and then that price was paid by both his father and his son. And so that's part of the reason why he chose not to run again in 1928. He also believed that, remember, had he gotten elected in 1928, he would have been in Washington since 1920 as vice president, or actually rather 1921 with the inauguration. So he would have been in Washington for about 12 years, and he thought that was far too much time to spend in government. He was very, as he said, I came from the people, I wish to return to them again. And after the end of his presidency, he moved back into the the same two-family home that he had left many years before. Of course, there was so much traffic there on that main street that he, in fact, had to move to a more gated place because everyone was coming to see the ex-president who they loved and thought dearly about. One thing I would say about Coolidge, which is really interesting, is that he had a sense of his own limitations as a man. He did not think of himself as sort of a prince, or like he did not think of himself as one of the great men, the great presidents. And yet at the same time, the people thought of him that way. He was extremely popular. And so, one of the questions I get asked all the time is, what responsibility, if any, should Calvin Coolidge have for the Great Depression? And my argument is that he should actually have quite little. That in fact he was, while it was the same party as Herbert Hoover, they did not agree on many policies. He famously referred to Herbert Hoover, his Commerce Secretary, as his wonder boy. He said, "For 6 years that man has given me unsolicited advice as Commerce Secretary, all of it bad." And when Coolidge is writing his post-presidential column, he's referring to the socialistic notions of government, which of course, that's even before Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes on the scene. So it's interesting that Coolidge gets some of the blame, but at the same time, the people thought that Coolidge should be president to deal with it. So there was a draft Coolidge campaign in 1928. There was even a draft Coolidge campaign in 1932. He, of course, dies in 1933. I think part of the problem that we think of when we think of the Great Depression is we don't give enough emphasis on what made it great, rather than just a regular old depression. In fact, the depression of 1919 to 1920, which the Harding-Coolidge ticket dealt with by essentially doing nothing, that recession was actually deeper and more severe than the initial crash in 1929. So what made the Great Depression great, I would argue, were the policies of Herbert Hoover and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, were towards more government intrusion in the economy, more uncertainty in the economy, and those are things that Coolidge, throughout his presidency, was against. I think it's important to understand that he was not necessarily saying Herbert Hoover is the problem. He was saying this country has this problem. This Washington has this problem. So he was not as specific as criticizing the president by name. Nevertheless, I think it's obvious if you read his post-presidential column who he's talking about. It's sort of hard for the president to escape blame, for the Great Depression being prolonged, which of course Herbert Hoover would have tried to do. So I think, to a certain extent, he was not sort of the type to kind of wade in and be kind of an ex-president who causes all this trouble. Yet at the same time, he also wanted to see his ideas, his principles triumph. And he also wanted to make a buck. He was among the most highly paid columnists in the entire world, which part of the reason he thought that was a bit unseemly, especially as people were suffering so much during the Great Depression, which is part of the reason he packed it in after only about a year and a few months after writing the sort of a daily column. So yeah, he's interesting in the sense that if you read those columns, they're written in a very breezy, very elegant style. They're very short, and it's almost like he's telling you a little story rather than kind of beating you over the head with something like you should oppose this policy or be in favor of this one. Part of it was they didn't know what to make of him. He was not of the party machine, at least initially. He had his own ideas about a lot of things, and they were actually well thought through ideas. They were classically inspired. He drew on his very serious education at Amherst College, which I argue in Why Coolidge Matters is sort of the big part of Coolidge. Effectively, he went to Amherst College. He was sort of a middling student, but at the same time, he was always reading. He was reading the Federalist Papers. He was reading ancient Greek and ancient Latin, sort of classical thinkers. He was getting the Whig interpretation of history. And he was inspired by the Declaration of Independence and inspired by kind of old literature, sort of romantic literature. And what Coolidge did there was he had a professor by the name of Charles Garman. And Charles Garman was a very religious man. William James called him one of the finest, the best teachers in the whole country. And this was somebody that Coolidge had studied under. This is somebody that many of the men, the Amherst men who would become a part of Coolidge's administration, this is the men that they had also studied under. And Coolidge tapped on these men because they had had this education. And Charles Garman, who's the professor's name, Charles Garman had this view that that God is constantly revealing truth to us, and that the old command from Holy Writ, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free," ought to be the basis of politics. And if you live in a republic, and as Lincoln said, republics are governed by public opinion, then truth ought to be the basis of that public opinion. So therefore, politicians or statesmen who speak the truth to the people will ultimately be triumphant in the end, even if the politics of expediency doesn't allow it in the short run. And Coolidge idolized Garman. He loved him. He writes in his very slim but very readable autobiography, he writes about Garman for 6 pages, which is more than he writes about his own wife, for instance, or even his own children. And what's interesting about Garman is that he had this sort of Christian view that he did not see as separate from the sort of love of country, the country's origins. So, Coolidge, of course, sees the Declaration of Independence in spiritual language. He talks about man having a spiritual nature, that if you touch it, it will respond as a magnet to the pole. And so he thought that politics really needs to be more than just facts and logic, that it needs to actually minister to people, but not be their savior. So I think that kind of separates him from kind of the more progressive Christian Democrat kind of thinking. And so what's interesting about this is that Coolidge takes this view with him throughout his whole life. He applies it to issues of trying to fight for an anti-lynching bill in the South to protect blacks. He applies it to censoring the Klan. He applies it to sort of what I call the nihilists of his day, the Klan, the eugenicists, the anarchists. And he sort of defeats each one of these groups in turn because he thinks each one of these groups is founded on a lie. The Klan on racial supremacy, the anarchists on the idea that there is no right to be governed, that there's no right to self-government, and of course the eugenicists, who he says can have all the instruments they want, but they can't really measure a man's soul and worth. And I think this kind of understanding of Coolidge's early education, he of course was always reading. He was an autodidact, even if he was a poor student, and he very much educated himself before he went on to become a lawyer by reading the law. And so he's always a good reader. He's always interested in these higher ideals, and they influenced him tremendously, and they ultimately, I think, are the foundation of his success as president, and ultimately what also needs to be restored.
Why did the elites of that time hate him? What was that?
What was it about?
Yeah.
Well, part of it was that the elites, just as the elites of our day, don't really understand the philosophical underpinnings of the country. And there are many people that when you come to Washington, D.C., want certain things from you when you're president that you think they ought not have. And Coolidge was very attuned to this. People didn't know quite what to make of him. He was sort of a practical joker among his Secret Service agents, but he was also very private. He was not a backslapper. He couldn't be sort of bribed and cajoled as some of his predecessors could be. And so they didn't know what to make of him. And they could also, I think, sense that he was very seriously educated and that they could not really find a way in to actually get him or break him. So what they tried to do to him is they tried to basically caricaturize him, which is why everyone knows of him as Silent Cal. Everyone thinks of the Roaring Twenties as this sort of glittering, champagne, bubbly, giant bubble, rather than actually looking at some of the very impressive technologies that were invented then that we still use today, like cars and radios and so forth. So I think Coolidge, part of the reason he was hated so much is that he was effective, and that he was loved by the people in a way that the elites say they never really want, but of course they always really do. And Coolidge's sort of central insight is that you can be the great communicator, as Reagan was. You can go to the people themselves through the presidency, through your speeches, through your, through the press even, because Coolidge had a very close relationship with the press, where he would give them all the access they wanted, but whenever he did a press conference, it was never it was never as president. It was a government official, right? So he still wanted the ability to kind of keep himself at bay. But I think, if you look at the 1920s and the 1930s, very few progressive historians wrote the histories of the 1920s. Of course, the left controls a lot of our education in this country. And it's not a very particularly sexy period, the 1920s. There's World War I and World War II that bookend it. So if you're a history teacher in high school, you're a lot more likely to cover the wars than to cover anything else. I, of course, was taught in high school at a very elite, liberal prep school, that FDR saved capitalism from itself, and that he was in fact a conservative figure. There was no real mention of the 3 Republican presidents between Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They were seen as they were caricaturized if they were even mentioned at all. So I think what my book, Why Coolidge Matters, seeks to do is it seeks to restore a neglected period in our history. Because I think there's so much that people know, as Reagan said, I think there's so much that people know that just isn't so. And I think it needs to be restored for us to fully understand the republic we live in. And I would argue that the Tea Party, for instance, which is always wants to go back to the Constitution and to Reagan, well, Coolidge is sort of the missing link between the two. Reagan was heavily influenced by Coolidge. He grew up listening to him on the radio. He read a Coolidge book while he was recovering from surgery. He had people at the White House giving lectures on Coolidge. He wrote to constituents about his admiration for Coolidge. And there's in fact quite a bit more, which I'm going to be writing an essay about. So conservatives want to go back to Reagan. They want to go back, and from Reagan they want to go back to the American founding. I argue that the line goes from the Tea Party to Reagan, Reagan to Coolidge, Coolidge to Lincoln, and Lincoln to the American founding. And that if you have that basis, you can be a seriously educated conservative. And I think that part of education, that's how we ultimately win.
Are there any Coolidges today?
Well, I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Senator Ted Cruz, who, of course, blurbed my book. I think Senator Cruz is very serious. I think he's very intellectual. I think he's well-read. I think he's well-credentialed. I'm very impressed with him. He, of course, did a number of things, like defend California's Proposition 209, which eliminates affirmative action from the system in California. He defended that when he was an attorney. He's very skilled at making arguments, and I think that's a very important role for any president. The president needs to be persuasive, that he needs to actually explain why he's doing what he's doing. And so I think Cruz very much falls in that Reagan model. I think there are others as well who could approach it. I think Paul Ryan has elements of it, but I think he's a bit too wonky, and he doesn't really understand that spiritual nature that we talked about earlier, the kind of getting men to feel it. I think I had thought previously that Marco Rubio would be such a candidate, but I don't think that he's as seriously intellectual as he needs to be to actually be successful. And I think Rand Paul is tempted could be a Coolidge-like figure, but he's tempted a little too often by some of the more crazy libertarian ideas rather than sort of the more sensible libertarian ideas. And similarly, I would say that Scott Walker, who did the police strike the teachers' union strike of a few years ago, he was very Coolidge-like in how he responded to that crisis. I would just say that I think he needs to make the case on a moral as well as an economic basis. You can't just make efficiency arguments all day and hope that they'll carry the day. But those are some names that keep popping up. But I think as a country, we need to do a better job of producing a pipeline that produces Coolidges at all levels. I mean, as Coolidge said, that local government local government is more important than federal government. That local government is how most people deal with government. And so I think across the country, particularly where I live in Los Angeles and where I'm from in Boston, the local governments are not always the most honest or ethical or above board. And so we need to get people elected who are good at the local level as well, and help them kind of go as Coolidge did from city councilman to president. Well, I think presidents are products of their education. So we've already talked about Coolidge and Amherst. My next book, I hope, will be about Obama's education. And I went with my fiance, who's Indonesian, to Indonesia. We went to Hawaii. I've gone to Occidental, to Columbia, to Harvard Law School, to Chicago. And the president, what's interesting about the president is he's almost always behaved as sort of a prince-like figure. So when he's at his first school, the San Francisco Assisi School, which was St. Francis of Assisi School, which was a Dutch school that was founded, a Catholic school in Indonesia, he was raised, or he was one of the few Muslims there, so he was an odd duck there. Then he went to the sort of government school that you send your kids to when you're rich in Indonesia, where he was known as the black kid. And then, of course, he goes to Punahou in Hawaii, where he tells everyone he's an Indonesian prince. And then he goes to Occidental and Columbia. And during that time, he becomes sort of a black guy at a time when affirmative action is a very hot topic, and where he's sort of the thing that all the white liberals like. So I think he's always considered himself a great man. He's always considered himself better than everyone else. And his view of compromise is the far left and the slightly less far left getting together. He has no real experience with everyday Americans. He didn't grow up in that kind of environment. He doesn't understand their fears, their hopes, their dreams. And so it's ironic in a certain sense that he ran on hope and change. I mean, he's done a lot of change, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of hope in this country. And I think that Coolidge understood that the reason you want limited government is not just because you want to save money, it's because you want to save men. The government has to be paid for in some form. Every time you spend $1, you have to get $1 from somebody, and if you take more dollars from them, they can't work out their own progress. They can't educate their own children. They can't buy their own dresses, their own food, their own books, their own music. To be really, a properly educated person. And I think Coolidge understood this, and I think Obama does not. I think Obama is a product of his education. I know that his first ever speech, for instance, was on racial preferences, which is something that, at Occidental, which is something that Calvin Coolidge found repugnant and disgusting, rightfully so. And I think, you see that Barack Obama goes to Harvard Law School, where he studies under the critical legal theorists who believe that power makes law rather than justice makes law, or principle makes law, which of course is another thing that I think we should rightfully find disgusting, and which Coolidge I think also would have felt disgusted by. I mean, we can pray. I mean, I've always argued that what we need, in a certain sense, is a religious revival as well. Maybe not necessarily on the Christian level, but certainly on a moral level. Self-government means self-support, as Coolidge said. You cannot have a government in which people are dependent on government, where they basically become clients or slaves or serfs of the state. And I think that's increasingly happening. I think the fiscal matters will ultimately triumph. I think you can't keep borrowing at the rates we're borrowing at, and expect the bill to never come due. And I think what that will do is that will force the revolution. I think all revolutions, though, I mean, just as the American founding was a revolution based not just on taxes but also on principles, every revolution needs a serious principle behind it. At least one.
And I think what we need to do is we need to make the case not just that the FDR revolution is fiscally, eating the future, right? Or the welfare state is eating its seed corn, right? And making sort of younger people like ourselves basically the piggy banks by which the older folks rate us. I think the fiscal matters we need to address and we need to speak about. We also need to speak about the moral matters too. I mean, what does it tell you that a country where people can't afford to have children because they're taxed so much that even though they want to have kids, they can't afford it? Or what does it tell you about a country where their grandparents are living a life of luxury while while the grandchildren are moving back in with their parents because they can't move anywhere else? I think these kind of moral dimensions and speaking about the average person and working out his own progress as Coolidge understood it, I think that's the kind of arguments we need to be making. And we need to be making it to all Americans, not pandering to blacks or quote-unquote Hispanics, which, of course, the whole phrase Hispanic is a little insulting. I mean, they're Mexican Americans, they're Cuban Americans, they're all sorts of different sorts of Americans, and they're all Americans, and we should speak to them as such. So I would just say that I think conservatives, if they want to be triumphant, they need to knock on a lot more doors. They need to go into a lot of places that they're going to be uncomfortable in. I mean, last night I hung out with a bunch of gay guys and talked about Calvin Coolidge. We've got to get our message out. We've got to get our ideas out to as many people as we can, because that's the only way we'll be triumphant. And I think Coolidge can teach us how to do that. And I think that we very much need a revolution, and we need it soon. But the question is, on what principles shall it be based? And my fear is that, my worry is that the revolution will be in the Occupy direction rather than in the Tea Party direction. And I think that's something we need to be leery of and combat very seriously. And I would say one other thing too. Almost every revolution starts in the schools. The progressive movement started in the schools, the German schools, where they learned sort of this historicist view. Woodrow Wilson, who of course is its great architect, is a product of Princeton. He was president of Princeton, and he was our first PhD president. Barack Obama is our first Harvard JD president, and that also shows. So we need to figure out a way in which we can actually go and make sure that what people are learning in schools is actually real knowledge and real education rather than just mere credentialing. And I think conservatives more often than not are dismissive. There's sort of this view that everyone gets to be poor, everyone gets to go to college, and that college is just these fuddy-duddy professors. But the ideas that people have in these schools can be very dangerous, and they need to be combated. They need to be seriously questioned. The sort of Howard Zinn interpretation of history, the sort of idea that America is always wrong, those sort of ideas that are taught in our public schools and in our colleges need to be seriously combated, because what will happen is that you'll raise a generation of children who hate America, who are American. And that, I think, is extremely dangerous, and conservatives neglect it at their peril. I mean, as I argue in the book and have argued elsewhere, he who controls the schoolhouse ultimately controls the White House. And Barack Obama is a product of his education. Calvin Coolidge is a product of his education. Abraham Lincoln is a product of his education. And we need to move more towards the Coolidge-Lincoln model and away from the Barack Obama, citizen of the world, entitled mindset.
To politics in his day, and which I argue should be applied to politics in our day. Well, there's sort of this image of Coolidge as sort of this Puritan in Babylon is the title of one of the books that tried to dismiss him. I think what Coolidge understood about technology is that technology really just means, if you break it down, it means skills, right? It means, it's the Greek word that it comes from. So the skills are really about to do what, right? And I think what Coolidge understood is that technology, particularly radio, which he made excellent use of during his political career. He was, of course, a very shy man, and so he used radio to kind of communicate his messages. He was the first president to appear on on television, or on film rather, he understood that the wars of the future would be fought with airplanes. So he was very forward-thinking in his views of technology, but he thought technology was about doing things, not about changing how man actually behaves. So a lot of people, I would say today, treat the digital revolution, the iPod revolution, like it's a digital playground. And Coolidge thought that effectively, you get a car, you get a plane, or you get a radio, and it's about actually just doing more work and being more efficient. So if you look at like the 1920s, the expansion in wealth per capita in the country was it's like the equivalent of getting a 33% raise during the 6 years of the Coolidge presidency, which is pretty unprecedented. But Coolidge, if everyone sort of famously thinks of him saying is the business of America is business, when in fact in the same speech he says that the real focus of America is idealism. That if we get our idealism right, if we get our ideas right, if we get our first principles right, the technology and the economic growth will follow. And I think that's something that conservative politicians should learn today, that we need to get our principles right first before we create policies. Conservatism lately has become something of a club, that it doesn't have quite the small e evangelical, going out and trying to speak to different groups about your ideas and how they actually work. I'm not saying that one should pander to different groups. I think that's more the province of the far left and the Democratic Party. I think you should go and speak to them as fellow citizens. And Coolidge mastered this technique. He was a sort of progressive Republican who got conservative Irish Democrats to vote for him. And he did that in Massachusetts by going door to door and by talking to his fellow citizens as fellow citizens. He went and spoke in front of black groups, Irish groups, Italian groups, Jewish groups, Native American groups. He actually joined several Indian tribes after he signed the law that made Indians, all Native Americans in the country, full and equal citizens. And he did this because he thought that if they can join the tribe of America, I should. Calvin Coolidge was the President of the United States from 1923 until 1929. He had a larger career that started when he was a city councilman in Northampton, and he worked his way up from city councilman, ran for 19 races, won 18 of them, and eventually ended up becoming President of the United States. And my book, Why Coolidge Matters, is about his political philosophy, which I argue has been edited out of the history books by New Deal historians who didn't want Coolidge to be remembered favorably. So Coolidge, in my view, was not small government. He was limited government. He believed in small r republicanism. He believed that the Declaration of Independence should be the basis of our politics, particularly its emphasis on all are created equal. He reasoned from Christian teaching that as we all have a common bond, or a common father in God the Father, so too are we equal Republican brothers. And so therefore the only form of government that's possible is republicanism. And so this is the Declaration of Independence is sort of how he applied all of his ideas to contemporary. Look to government unions. Coolidge's view is that essentially a government union is a conflict of interest in which you cannot be a public servant but also become have a loyalty to something other than the public. And so in the famous police strike of 1919, which catapulted Coolidge to national fame, what Coolidge did was he called in the National Guard when the police officers walked off the job because they couldn't be permitted to join a union. It's something that kind of conservatives would do well to kind of study and learn from. Ronald Reagan, we know, he thought of Coolidge as his favorite president. We know that he was influenced by Coolidge's decision in the strike of 1919 when he fired all the air traffic controllers in 1981. So it's something that I think what Coolidge understood about politics is that one can actually reclaim equality as a conservative principle, and the idea that some men shouldn't rule others just by virtue of their birth or by the virtue of their degree or how long their families have been in this country. And so he was very clever about applying the idea that all men are created equal to politics, like government unions, like even the Industrial Revolution. I mean, if you think about it, an industrial revolution can be a political problem, and that if I employ you and I pay you terrible, terrible, terrible wages and basically exploit you, it's very difficult for us to have a republican form of government, because I'm effectively your master and you're effectively my slave. To be able to join their tribe, that we can have a multiracial, multi-ethnic, but not multicultural America. And I think that's something that Coolidge really typified. I mean, he had to run for re-election in his early career every year. So he was very close to the people. He understood what they wanted, what their hopes were, what their dreams were. And it's something that conservative politicians today, I think we often get kind of snookered by the consultant class, which looks for wealthy people who've never had any real experience in politics and tries to basically take them for a ride, often convincing very wealthy conservatives in states they have no business even contending in that they can actually win elections. And that, of course, distorts our politics. Coolidge was very much a bottom-up rather than a top-down politician. It's something I think we as conservatives, we on the right, need to study as well. They're virtually identical in some respects. I mean, obviously they didn't have gay marriage. They didn't think of those issues in quite the same way we think of them today. But public sector unions, government unions were a hot issue at the time. There were a number of anarchist bombings in the late 19-teens, early 1920s, and Coolidge responded to all of these issues very effectively. Immigration, of course, was an issue then. There's sort of a number of issues that we can look to Coolidge to study. So, for instance,